Should I wait?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, there we go.
Okay. Hi. For
Okay.
those of you
Hold it right.
who are not familiar with me, I'll introduce myself, and Deanne has also. I'm Mary Tomlinson, used to be Overwater. I grew up on our family farm on Hearthstone Road, the second of 9 children. Eileen and Diane asked if someone in our family would be interested in giving a short talk on market gardening in early Charleswood, and here we are. Not knowing any other gardeners or farmers in our area when we were growing up, what I'll talk about will be basically the Overwater family history as I remember it. My grandma and grandpa Overwater, picture, immigrated from Holland. Grandpa came in 1907. I'm not sure when Grandma came. And they got married and started their family. My dad, Jake Overwater, was the eldest of what grew to be 9 children. In Holland, Grandma's family were involved in shipbuilding. Grandpa's family were market gardeners, and that's what they planned to do in Canada. They settled in Charleswood, renting what was referred to as the Jones Farm on Wilkes Avenue. The farm boasted a huge house, as well as what was reputed to be the largest barn in Western Canada. They never filled the barn. They did have a few cattle. They also had barn dances there in the early 40s, oh no, in the late 30s, I think. They had barn dances. Apparently they had the barn dances until they heard some guys from the north end were going to come out and have a rumble. They didn't want any fights, and that was the end of the barn dances. But it was a way of making a few dollars. Grandma and my aunts would bake cookies, and they would have stuff to sell, and they'd have a good time. The farm on Wilkes had good soil and produced well. Potatoes, onions, cauliflower, lettuce, and I'm sure corn were among the other crops. Spinach was one of the special crops that Grandpa liked to grow. Dad knew, spinach was one of the crops that they liked to talk about. In a day when imported produce was extremely expensive in the winter, the first farmer to have something fresh to sell in the spring would get the best money. And the Overwaters knew that if you planted your spinach in the fall, chances are you would have an early crop in the spring because it would overwinter. And that he used to think that was just the most wonderful thing, and spinach was always a family favorite for him. And one of my sisters likes spinach too.
But not you?
Not so much. They had horses in the early years, but by the late 1940s, machinery had taken over. The only horse I recall was a big farm horse called Snowball, and I don't have a picture of it. I remember my sisters and I sitting on it. We would have loved to have ride it, but it was just such a big thing, we would fall off. Anyway, by this time, Dad, being the oldest son, had taken over many of the responsibilities in running the farm. My grandfather had lost all the fingers on one of his hands in a sawing accident. I think they were sawing a lot of firewood, and he just had a stump on one hand, and he didn't really trust machinery after that. So it was up to Dad to do a lot of things. Dad took to machinery like a duck to water, and in all his years in farming, it's hard to recall anything he could not fix or make run. Now this place on Wilkes was home for many years until the family had expanded to include my mum and 4 children. The family had wanted to buy land for a farm, but at that point they hadn't been able to find the right fit. And listening to Jack, it sounds like land wasn't that accessible or that readily available way back then. They tried a possible location in Bird's Hill for a couple of years, but that was not practical. It was too far from the home farm. And when my dad heard about a property on McCreary Road being available, he jumped at the chance to buy it before somebody else could get to it. Now, once the Overwater this is the, the upper circle is where the farm was on Wilkes. There's just a bunch of trees there now just off of McCreary. That's where the house was. The barn burnt, and there's, I think, on the little display, there's an article on the Free Press, from the Free Press about the barn burning, and then the house burned sometime long after the family was off the farm, I believe. On McCreary Road, the houses were built in that yellow circle, and then it went way back almost to the cement plant, or the quarry or whatever it is at the end of the road on McCreary. Anyway, once the Overwater family was settled on McCreary Road, Dad started to look for his own place and hoped to have better luck further afield. He and my mum and then 5 children packed up all their belongings in a truck and a car and set out for BC, where my Auntie Anne was living and where several Dutch farmers had established farms. Dad hoped to find something to buy in that area. Nothing suitable was found, so about a year later we all packed up, moved back to Manitoba and McCreary Road again. And we lived there for a short time until Dad was able to find his own place on Hearthstone Road. Once he had his own land, Dad had his work cut out for himself and Mum. He had to build a house. He had to get machinery. He had to get crops in. He had to get some kind of shelter for animals and machinery. He needed granaries. The farm that he bought had a homestead just south of Wilkes, and at the time we moved in, I'm not sure if there was an older house there at the time. It burnt anyway before we settled. And there was a huge barn, a really nice barn. We really thought we could have horses in it. But of course, you know, horses weren't to be. And there was a big machine shed. At any rate, the barn stayed there for a while. The machine shed, Dad moved back to Hearthstone Road, and the house had to be built for us. Now, while Dad's background was in market gardening, he preferred crops that were more mechanized. Grain was always important. We had a lot of acres of it. Wheat, oats, sometimes barley and rapeseed. These were crops that could be managed without too much outside help. Combines and swathers cooperating, and they didn't always cooperate because when you're starting from the ground up, you don't have money to buy new machinery. You can't buy a $100,000 combine. You buy a used one and fix it. And we did a lot of fixing. As the family grew older, we all learned how to use a shovel and really got to like and appreciate grain augers and dump trucks. Because at one time, if you're shoveling grain and you don't have a dump truck, you have to shove it out a little hole in the back. And you really don't want to be hand shoveling barley. And you know how itchy barley gets if you've ever had anything to do with the farm. You don't want to be doing that on a hot summer day. Well, we usually had a field of alfalfa somewhere on the farm. It was good for the soil, and the alfalfa plant sometime would come and harvest it. Otherwise, we could bale it. We had a cow or two that needed winter feed, and hay could be sold. Once Dad had a baler, he even did custom baling. And we got to stack bales behind the baler. My sister Irene was talking about that today. She said, yeah, well, she used to do it. And I thought, you're one of the smaller kids. Did you really do it? You would stack the bales 4 high, 2 piles of 8 on a skid. And then when the skid was full, you had this iron bar. You would jam in the ground, hold it really tight, and the tractor would drive on, and you'd walk the bales off the skid. Yeah, we were about 12. You get to be strong on the farm. Now, sugar beets. That was the story of our summer, from the end of the school year till freeze-up. The Manitoba Sugar Company contracted the beet farmers for an acreage quota that could vary from year to year. Dad's quota varied from 25 acres to nearly 100 acres. The beets would be planted in early May. By mid-June, they would be ready for first chop. First chop means first hoeing. That's a lot of work. That would be thinning and weeding by hand or hoe. In mid-July, the crop would be ready for the second chop, which involved correcting mistakes from the first hoeing and any new weeds. A hard worker might hoe 1 acre a day if the fields were not too weedy. And I could almost do 1 acre a day if I was really fast. Labor for sugar beets came from wherever a farmer could find it. Oh, I think we're...
Are we fast?
I think I've lost you. No. Yeah. Oh, there's a picture. Deer were a problem back then, and there's a little story about deer too. Apparently, there were a lot of deer trampling the potatoes at one time. And I think in the dead of night, a few people went out and took care of the problem. And I think the house
Yes.
at the back is the house from that they lived in on Wilkes.
Oh.
Yeah. So I guess deer aren't just our plague right now. Oh, and there's my mom. My mom, the city girl, driving the tractor. I think that's one of the few times I've ever seen her on a tractor. Okay, what have we got next? Oh, and this is the Westward Hoe, the article on the Overwaters traveling out to BC. And I have actually, there's a copy over on the board there. And once again, the Hearthstone Road Farm. It would be there. Oh, and this is just some of the problems you run into. There was one year there was an awful lot of flooding, and we had a lot of water pictures. The house at the back is a granary. The shed to the right was the one that my dad moved from south of Wilkes to the farm. More water. When you had that much water, what typically Dad would do is take his big tractor, drive right through the field and make ruts to the ditch. Try to drain it that way. There was a lot of low land on the farm. And this is the house that they built when they moved. First of all, there was Mom, Dad, and I think 5 and 6 coming kids. And we lived in that house for a while. As I said, it was always going to be the garage. We were always going to get our real house, but we didn't for about 10 years. And there are granaries in the back, and that's one of the big tractors my dad loved. That's one of the biggest ones, I think. Oh, sugar beets, that's where we are. Yeah. Sorry to get ahead of you.
Good stories.
Okay, back to sugar beets. Yeah, mostly labor came from the reserves. Dad would go up and get people from the reserves to come in for a few weeks. They didn't seem to mind coming. The exhibition was on at that time, and they could. It was like a holiday for some of them. I mean, if you're hoeing sugar beets a holiday.
Yeah.
But the labor had to be accommodated on the farm in whatever bunkhouses could be accessed. The granaries were used as a bunkhouse. My dad got, from the railway, he got a bunk car, and that was a bunkhouse. That worked quite well. And the labor stayed in the bunkhouses. My mom did the shopping for them. They cooked in the old kitchen in the garage, I believe. It was just for a few weeks, but whatever. But anyway, back to the other labor. Advertising sometimes brought people. One year, when the CFL was on strike, we had a football player try it out. He didn't last long. He thought there would be a better way to stay in shape than hoeing sugar beets. All the kids in our family had their turn hoeing sugar beets. Out to the field at 8 in the morning, back for dinner at 12. Out again to the field at 1, home at 6. Some days we really hoped for rain. It had to be a darn good rain or we'd be out hoeing anyway. And we'd have to take a scraper for our hoe. And I have my hoe over there with a scraper. A scraper is half a hacksaw blade. Worked better than anything. And it wasn't all bad. We got to work on our tans in the field. And when the sugar beet payment came in the fall, we each got a nice check for our year's work. We kept track of our rows, wrote it down, got the same rate as any of the labor, and added up to a tidy little bit of money. In later years, thinning the sugar beets could be done mechanically. Some of us thought maybe because the older kids weren't hoeing sugar beets and the younger kids weren't very good at it, my dad had to get the machine. But apparently it's because the sugar beet seed had improved, so thinning could be done by machine. The sugar beet seed, what they have now is monogerm, which means one plant comes per seed. In the early days it was whatever. Anyway, you'd get maybe 2 or 3 plants coming up from the same seed, and you'd have to knock out 2 of them or your sugar beets would not be any good. They wouldn't be big enough. So it had to be thinned, and it was kind of hard work, but anyhow, there were still pockets that had to be hoed by hand. And for a few years, some of the grandkids had the pleasure, and they loved it. Just ask them. And harvest was something else, evolving through the years. Early on, beets were pulled by hand and thrown on a truck. And I have a sugar beet knife. Get it.
Ooh. There we go.
This is a sugar beet knife. The hook, you hammer into the sugar beet, pull it out, then grab it in your hand, knock the top off, and then throw the sugar beet on the truck. And this is what they did at the very start, in the very early days of sugar beets, like back in the 40s, I think, early 40s. I even did it when I was using a sugar beet knife when I was maybe 6, I think, and I have a scar on my finger to prove it. I saw bone.
Ooh.
It healed, didn't get infected, but I don't know if I was allowed to use a knife so much anymore. Anyway, soon there was a loader that would pick them off the ground and convey them onto a truck. And in later years, we had the harvester that would dig them up, put them up a pulley, put them on a table, on a cleaning table, and then they'd be dropped into a hopper. Once the hopper was filled, they'd be loaded onto a truck. Sounds simple, but not so much if the fall had been wet, some soil. And you got to think Manitoba gumbo, it sticks and it's hard. The beets would be dirty. And then you would have 1 or 2 people standing on platforms at the back of the harvester, and you could knock any excess mud or beet tops off that you didn't want going to the beet factory. If your beets were dirty, you would be penalized with a high tear number for dirty beets. And there were times the ground was so mucky, we had to get up early, while the overnight frost kept the ground solid enough to get a load of beets off to the factory. And then when the mud was so solid, you had a hammer when you were riding on the harvester. And if there was a lump hanging onto the beet, you hit it with a hammer. And that separated it. Yeah, there were an awful lot of mornings we were sleeping in school. Okay. Anyhow.
I got a potato picture there next. Are we going to get to that?
Yeah, we're not quite at potatoes yet. Yeah. Beets were the big thing. Once the beets were on the truck, you were still not home free. Anything might happen. A truck could tip coming out of the field and spill all its beets. It could stall on the railway tracks, or it could be stuck in the field because the ground was mucky. And the tractor trying to pull it out the truck might even get stuck as well. All of these things happened. I think twice a load of beets dumped. Once it stalled on the track, and I think fortunately my dad had a tractor nearby, he could push it off. And when the truck tipped, I think you hook a chain to it, get a couple of tractors and you straighten it up, and then somebody has to throw the beets back on the truck. A lot of work. But anyway, sugar beets were an important crop for the farm. While they were labor intensive, they provided a decent return, and the initial check usually came in the fall, and it was kind of a special time. Like Dad would have us all there, and he'd have the beet check, and then he'd write us all our checks for the work we had done. And he had a little bit of money to pay his bills, and to get money in the fall is a good thing for a farmer. Now, with a background in market gardening, some of the crop choices were obvious. Thankfully, we didn't grow spinach except for home use, and probably too much of that. But some of the crops grown back on Wilkes were also grown on Hearthstone Road. Onions were one crop. For a few years, a couple of acres of onion sets were grown. Onion sets are grown in rows that are about this far apart, and they have to be, on our farm anyway, they were planted with a cedar, like a wheel hoe cedar. They were weeded with a wheel hoe, and then you would go on hands and knees and pick out the weeds by the onions. They were harvested by hand, laid in rows to dry, and then you'd squeeze them, you twist the tops off and throw them into something, grate them, and get them ready to go. Outside labor was sometimes needed for the onion sets. You know, it was a good crop for a family with a lot of kids, but you still couldn't do it all, and you needed outside help. And storage could be a problem if you didn't have a root cellar, and we never did, so the crop had to be sold as soon as possible. I think we grew regular onions a couple of times, and I think one of the past pictures Len had a load of onions from the old farm, but we never did that many. But we did grow potatoes for many years.
Got it.
There.
Okay.
Oh, this is the latest, the very latest method of harvesting your potatoes. We usually had a few acres. May long weekend meant cutting seed potatoes. You'd be cutting seed potatoes, and if you cut enough, you would have fireworks. If they were not to be planted immediately, we dusted them with lime to keep the cut potatoes from spoiling. We had a 2-row planter, and as long as I can remember, it looked like a really old, rusty piece of machinery, but it did the job as well for us as well as my uncles. We also had a 2-row digger, and I think there's a picture of the digger on the board over there.
What did you do with the potatoes? You actually cut them?
Yep, you just cut them. You leave an eye in each piece.
Oh, really?
Oh, I thought everybody knew that. Another bit of information. Yeah, we had the 2-row digger, and it was equally as old as the planter, but it worked. But the potatoes still had to be picked up by hand, and outside help was needed. Once again, the day the potatoes were to be picked, Dad would head out to the north end to look for labor, and I think Jack talked about getting labor out in the north end, and it was usually immigrant women. They'd get out in the early morning, and they'd be on the streets, and a farmer would come, and some of them had their favorites. Dad would be really early going out there because he kind of knew who the good workers were, and he wanted to make sure he had some. He could get the good ones. Once the potatoes were picked and bagged and loaded onto a truck, then back to the yard to be graded, bagged, weighed, and taken to market. Although we were young at the time, we kids had our responsibilities. We would help pick sometimes, but more often we held the bags when anybody needed to dump a pail, or ran to get pails or bags, or even coffee or water when needed. Usually, my mom would have coffee for the workers and maybe a cookie or something. One of us, usually my sister Anne, being the oldest child around, got to steer the truck while it was being loaded in the field. My dad would put the truck in first gear to make sure it wasn't going too fast and get her to steer. If she ran into difficulty, he could quickly run up and hop on the running board and set it straight. She must have been 6 or 7 at that time. At home, we would help with grading the potatoes. Many hands would make the work go faster. I don't recall specifically where the potatoes were sold, except it was somewhere downtown. Although my brother Albert remembers he got to go along for the ride once. Albert was the first boy after 4 girls, and he was really special. Anyway, he got to go, and he remembers delivering a load of potatoes to Eaton's, and they drove the truck right into the store, onto an elevator, and up to the 2nd floor. I didn't get to see that. In the later years, we grew at most maybe an acre, enough for home use and some for house sales. I think the marketing board came in there and it made things a little bit awkward. We could manage without outside help. Come fall and potato picking season, kids and grandkids got to help again. Typically, we'd have a couple of babies, and if it was a potato picking day, we'd have a nice little box with a cozy blanket in the field, and you weren't initiated until your kid had been in the potato field while you picked. We didn't mind spending a sunny September afternoon hanging out in the potato field. Loading up the bags was the hardest part. By this time, Dad had either pulled a trailer or he had a pickup truck. And if we were really lucky, a husband, a cousin, a friend like big tall Rob in the back might be passing by, and we could coerce them into or get them to volunteer to help throw the potatoes on the truck. Then we come to corn. That was always the ultimate favorite, even right to Dad's last years on the farm.
I got that one better.
Ah, way to go. Gold star. Yeah, this is the corn seeder. It's it would plant 2 rows of corn at a time. Very old, very rickety. Looks kind of neat. My brother took it back to Alberta in his car because he wanted to have something to remind him of the farm in his garden. So it sits up on a hill in Edmonton. Back to corn. Yeah, my dad grew corn for wholesale at one time. I think he thought it might be a good way to make some money. But he had to, what I remember of that is getting up in the dark morning, early, to pick the corn and fill a truck with the corn. There were 7 dozen to a bag, and we had to get it to the wholesaler in the city before the sun was up and it got too warm out. He would be back on the farm in time for breakfast. Corn varieties in those days started losing their sweetness as soon as they were picked, so you needed to get the corn off while it was still cool from the night. The varieties we have today tend to retain sweetness much longer, and the timing isn't as crucial. You can keep your corn for, and I would never tell my dad, but I've kept corn for 3 or 4 days before I've eaten it. It was only when we were older that Dad would trust us to pick corn. You couldn't peel it to look. You had to learn what good corn felt like and what it should look like from the outside. And you couldn't be too slow. You couldn't pick it too far in advance. You didn't want it sitting around for more than a few hours. Any longer than that, you had to refrigerate it or freeze it yourself. Or in the old days, can it. You also didn't want to get it too ripe in the field. It would lose quality. And if it was ripening too fast, you got to freeze more. I think I was eating frozen corn for about 5 years after we got off the farm, and it still tasted great. Corn season was fast and furious, and sales could be as high as 50 or even 100 dozen a day. In the last years on the farm, my dad was in his 80s and he had reverted to his market garden roots. There was corn and potato sales, not so much, but enough. But any home garden surplus was up for sale. That included tomatoes, cucumbers, maybe beets, beans, even rhubarb. Thrifty farmers don't like to see anything go to waste. And my dad always liked to make the land, or the land pay. If you planted something, you wanted a return. And we were not so much a market garden as a mixed farm, a family farm where everyone is expected to help, and we all did our part. We learned to drive tractors. I learned to drive a dual range tractor when I was about 12 or 13. I could do a tractor. I didn't know a dual range, but if you grind the gears a couple of times, you get taught pretty fast. But I
found a potato sign.
Oh, potatoes. With my grandson. He also had a corn sign, but that's lost somewhere. I think it got burnt. Anyway, we drove tractors, milked cows, We always had a couple of cows. With a family of 9 children, you need milk. And you need meat. So we had cows. We all hoed sugar beets, shoveled grain, weeded gardens, and helped where needed. As we got older, our job descriptions changed. But even into adulthood and middle-aged, we remained connected to our farming roots. We lived in the city. Our backyard was 340 acres. We as a family learned to work together and to rely on each other. And maybe because of that, we still remain close. We worked hard, so did our whole family. We were grounded and we knew who we were and where we belonged. I don't know how many times we were told, play with your sister. You don't have to go to Brownies. Basically, this has been my story of market gardening in Charleswood. My brothers and sisters all have their stories as well. Margie, the youngest in the family, has a story that she said she would tell. We want to hear you.
Yeah, come on up.
She tells it better than I do.
Well, I was one of the younger ones, so my dad I wasn't really into the tractors. I wasn't allowed because I had brothers. But one day he came in after doing the fields, running into the house for supper. And he says, Margaret, go gas up the tractor. I went, okay. You don't want to please Dad. So I went and I saw 2 holes.
Oh no. Oh no.
And I thought, okay, the hole closest to the radiator, it's got to be that. So I used the other one. And I came in and he says, are you done? I said, yes. Dropped his plate, ran out, you filled the radiator. But all was good. He fixed it.
Yeah, the youngest has a little bit more leeway, I think. Yeah. Anyhow, I don't know if any of the other people have any. I have a few family people here. Any other stories?
Can we finish the pictures before we get?
Oh, yeah, finish the pictures.
Because that one's beautiful.
Yeah, yeah. That's the. I think that was the row crop special. That was probably the one Margie filled.
No, it was that one.
That was a big one. Oh, Margaret.
And that might be it.
And that's it.
So,
Thank you.
but you can tell more stories.
Well, I would just take a minute to just give a real thank you to my sister-in-law Rose, who is not here. But bless her heart, she took all of our old family pictures and put them on CDs, and that's where I got a lot of these things from. Otherwise, I'd be still digging out through boxes of photos. You know how many photos you get and never want to look at. But anyway, and thank you to the people here for asking us to tell our story. And I think there's a couple of other things on the table that I was thinking I might show. There's, I'll bring them here. The infamous beet knife, of course.